Hey everybody, it's Elon from Inside Fighting, and today we're going to do things a little bit different. We're going to have a little watch party. We're going to watch some of those old Gracie challenges, and I'm going to give you my thoughts. I have some controversial opinions about Brazilian Jiu-jitsu, especially for a second-degree black belt. I've been training almost all my life. I guess you call it my adult life? Well, stay tuned. We're jumping right in.
Pow, pow. Inside fighting, yeah. Dangerous martial arts. Pow, pow. Ooh, ah.
All right, guys, so before I get started, I always request you check out InsideFightingStore.com. See if you like something on there. Maybe the instructionals, maybe some of the merch, T-shirts, you know? What is going on with me today? Nobody knows. Anyway, if you buy an instructional and you don't like it, I'll give you your money back. That's my guarantee. I always say it. Anyway, let's just jump right in. We're going to watch some of the Gracie challenges voiced by the wonderful Gracie. And look, I have my thoughts. Number one, let me just give you my thoughts on jiu-jitsu so you come in with a transparent view of what I believe. So I think jiu-jitsu used to be far more street effective. It used to be far more MMA oriented. It's become a sport. I'm not saying that's necessarily a bad thing. The quality of grappling for Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu has increased to beat Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu guys. In other words, if you took any Jiu-Jitsu practitioner of the day today, who's a high-level black belt, from Gordon Ryan down to it doesn't matter who, you would see them defeating the high-level guys of the past. That's just what I honestly believe. The art has evolved. The question is, would they beat them in MMA? Would they beat them in the street? That's what I don't know. And does the average person who's training jiu-jitsu to black belt come out as prepared as guys used to? There used to be a different level of toughness, which we're going to see right here in the Gracie challenges. Now, let me say one more thing, which is controversial. The Gracies filmed these challenges. I highly doubt they promoted and filmed and released the ones where they lost. It's hard for me to believe they won every challenge throughout all of history, because you can go look at Vale Tudo challenges, which we will eventually one day, where they did lose. Okay, and then, guys like Sakuraba, who started beating them.
Wearing yellow trunks, has 15 years of training and claimed to be undefeated. At 180 pounds, he had a 15-pound advantage over my brother Royce. The Gung Fu man will rely on strikes in order to avoid going to the ground.
I mean, Horian always hypes these things up. He's like, this guy has 748 years of experience and, has boxed, and he's a world champion in judo. And then you research the people, and they're not exactly that. But it doesn't matter. This guy's clearly experienced in striking. But the reality here is he gets taken down as a headlock while Royce is mounted on him. So for anyone who doesn't know, you're never going to finish from that position. That's a useless position to hold the headlock. You're tiring out your arm. And so the interesting thing here is we clearly see time and time again that in a world where people are not trained in grappling, getting taken down in a one-on-one fight in a controlled environment is inevitable if the other person is trained at doing that. Almost inevitable. What's very fascinating about that is it's brilliant. And now he's taken the back, and he's going to choke out the Kung Fu guy. What's brilliant about this system and the way it's marketed is martial arts, as much as we say is not ego-driven, is in fact ego-driven. That was beautiful how he rolled with the back to maintain it. And so there is a certain degree of ego, especially back in the day, but even just as much today. That's the reality. As much as we try and talk like, oh, yeah, my ego's gone, we still want to be tough. We still want to believe our system is beating other people's systems. And so jiu-jitsu, if you were going to create a system to beat other martial artists in unarmed combat, one-on-one, in a controlled environment with a specific rule set, it's an incredible system. That's a very niche, specific thing. But when it comes to bravado, when it comes to ego, that's almost everything. These tapes, by the way, are the reason I got into Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. This and then early UFCs, and there were some demos I remember that were incredible by Hickson and Hoyler early on that I thought were just beautiful. And I needed to learn jiu-jitsu after I saw that because it looked like a superpower. And what I will say is jiu-jitsu is a superpower. We see it right here with Royce. Easily dominating, and the same thing happened in UFC 1. Not only dominating, but dominating in a way where he doesn't have to damage the guy too much and can just beat him. And it's almost more embarrassing. And the smaller guy in jiu-jitsu really can beat the bigger guy. And here, this is coming on to the end of the fight. The guy's pretty much done, and he knows it. Let me just come back to me before we go to the next one. So what did we learn there? We learned, again, that in a very specific rule set, jiu-jitsu really does shine. And that's important because especially old school jiu-jitsu where you're allowed to strike, they were a little bit more MMA oriented. And it wasn't as much a sport. It was a way to prove you're tough, especially against other martial artists. Now, that rule set, again, does not always convert to street fighting. Street fighting is a lot harder to smash people down on concrete, both for yourself and for them. If you take them down wrong and you hit your head, we've even seen people get knocked out in the ring from hitting their heads on the mat. Imagine hitting your forehead on concrete. I remember taking someone down on concrete and my elbow just hit the ground and it was scraped completely open and busted. Doesn't matter if I'm able to beat that person after. I'm still incurring a lot of damage, and a little bit more that could have been my shoulder. It could have been my head. Could have been anything. Takedowns are wild. They're unpredictable, especially against people, by the way, who are not trained in them. You end up falling different. The more trained someone is, the more controlled the takedowns typically end up being because you both know where it's going. But in a street fight, I found takedowns tend to be very weird and a little bit more unpredictable because I'm not used to the person's movement. And I'll say that's true of striking also. It's a good lesson. Sometimes I have an easier time fighting a blue belt in jiu-jitsu or even a purple belt than I do a new white belt who's just a strong dude who doesn't know what they're doing because they tend to be more forceful, erratic, and unpredictable and move in a way that I'm not used to. So even though there's someone more trained, as a black belt, I'm more comfortable against the person I have been doing things against or the style I have been doing things against for 20 plus years. I don't have experience again against an unpredictable white belt who's moving unlike anyone else that I've trained against for a while, if that makes sense. You end up getting caught with elbows, weird things. They just end up being very, very erratic. And so, again, jiu-jitsu is an optimized system. It's the perfect system if you were going to create a system, especially back in the day, to beat other martial artists in one-on-one combat. Again, that doesn't necessarily mean it's the best system in the world for self-defense. Self-defense is rarely one-on-one unarmed combat, and especially with the agreement of not taking it one step further to do some other things. So let's just look at this challenge right here. This is a good one. Right here. We don't need to hear the voice in the back, but if you look in the beginning, this is a guy called John Burke, and he has an academy. This is in Torrance. This took place. It's funny because I lived right by there, and you can see the guy he's fighting actually has some grappling experience as a big dude, but he's also a big dude. And this looks like a one-on-one street fight that you would see literally in the street. This is what old school jiu-jitsu looked like. And this is probably, it's crazy that he pulled guard, but again, that's a bad habit. You rarely see that back in the day as much, but you did with Royce in the early UFCs when he was fighting someone so much bigger. But it's just a bad habit for the street. But at least you don't see butt scooting. At least you saw him establish control and posture so he could pull the guy onto him into a more closed guard where the guy's head is already broken down. It's a lot different than modern day jiu-jitsu where we literally just sit down on our butts and start moving forward. I'm not a fan of that. And what I'll say here is if you just look, the guy on the bottom was doing some very good things. I believe that's John Burke. You can see his elbow flaring here. That elbow is an overhook to prevent himself from getting hit. This is fundamental clean jiu-jitsu. This is jiu-jitsu you learn, I've said this many times, by blue belt. The question is, how much more do you need beyond this for street fighting? You don't need all the advanced techniques. These are very simple sweeps. The guy who's shirtless has some grappling background. He went for a very sloppy ankle lock. Reminds me a la Ken Shamrock, early UFC, where you don't get your knee in, you don't control the hips. But he's going for it again here. He's just Hail Marying for some ankle locks, and that's setting him up for an armbar. He's reaching it, and he's done there. That's loss number one. He's going to fight again, going to give himself some time to recover. There was an air of mystery and magic back in the 80s and 90s around martial arts during this period. And like when you fought, it was like a big deal. And it was just kind of cooler back then. But this is the kind of thing that sold jiu-jitsu to the masses, and rightfully so. The big lie here was that this is actually all-encompassing self-defense. Now, what I will say about early Gracie Jiu-Jitsu is there was an entire system outside of this as part of it that had a self-defense curriculum. And you still see this in some of the Gracie schools. You know where you see it? What are their names? They're in Miami, and they do like their own form of jiu-jitsu. And it's like they don't even call it Brazilian Jiu-jitsu anymore. If you know the answer to that, it's a good question. Leave it in the comments below. I'd actually like to hear. And again, a sloppy ankle lock. If you don't know how to do ankle locks, going for a straight Achilles. You know, back then we didn't even do heel hooks as much. And this is interesting also because jiu-jitsu guys were so resistant to heel hooks. I came from Sambo to Brazilian Jiu-jitsu. And I remember I was heel hooking everybody and knee barring everybody. By the time I was a blue belt in Brazilian Jiu-jitsu, purple and brown belts, competitive fighters who would come to the gym in New York, I was heel hooking people, and everyone, it was like an ongoing joke because it was so rare back then. We're talking about like 15, 17 years ago to do those kind of techniques. It was almost considered disrespectful, kind of about where we are with wrist locks today. Wrist locks are highly effective moves. They're very underappreciated. And with time, you're going to see them become more popular, just like ankle locks did. Bottom line here, this is not a position I'd want to be in the street, but this is a great position to be in against another martial artist, one-on-one fighting. There's this weird dichotomy, this weird kind of psychological thing where if I can dominate you man to man, it means that my martial art is better. And I really don't know how I feel about that because part of me actually agrees. I still believe Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, even in its modern day sport form, again, beautiful back take, even in its modern day, but you can see this is more fighting compared to the modern day form of jiu-jitsu. But even that is still a superpower. You still get a superpower in Brazilian jiu-jitsu today. It's just a more popular superpower that people can acquire. Back then, it was impossible to even find a purple belt to teach you. It's like a big deal. If you were a purple belt, a poo-poo belt, you were a poo-poo belt, and the guy's conscious. He's just acting defeated. But yeah, if you were a purple belt back in the day, that was a big deal. I remember when I first started learning from a black belt in Montreal, it was a huge deal. And then I went to New York, and there was a lot more black belts back then because that was kind of a hub, LA and New York, for all the Brazilians coming in. But man, oh man, jiu-jitsu back in the day, there were not many people training it. It was a lot tougher in terms of the damage you incurred. And MMA and jiu-jitsu were interlinked a lot more because there weren't really that many MMA schools. What happened is all these Brazilians came in. Some Americans have been training them for a while. You either had Americans or you had the old school Brazilians come and start teaching. And they taught it in a way where they knew you could back yourself up in a fight against other martial artists. Today, when you go into a jiu-jitsu academy, you're going in to learn to compete against other jiu-jitsu guys. You're not really learning to beat other martial artists. I remember my brain could not turn off when I first started learning Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. It was like something rewired in me. And I was constantly running. And I wish I could get this feeling back. I was constantly running scenarios, options. My mind was drilling when my body wasn't. It was like my mind was on fire and like creating new neural synapses. And when I would spar, it was an actual exploration of these things that my mind was doing. And so I could envision something the night before, go into the gym the next day and immediately test it out in a true way that it was human chess. And that to me is the real magic of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Why also, I will answer this. This is an interesting question. Well, why did Sambo guys lose against Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu? We're seeing them win nowadays. Why did Judo guys have such a hard time against Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu? There's a great video of, I don't remember if it's Jean-Jacques, it's one of the Machados. And I trained with Jean-Jacques and his guys, and they're fantastic. But they went into a Sambo and Judo competition and dominated. This old school. And the reason is because of a very specific thing. You look at a street fight. If I pick you up and I slam you on your back into the ground, usually fight's over. Whether you're a black belt in jiu-jitsu, whether you're a boxer, it doesn't matter what you are. Sambo, and Judo far excel at that than they do at continuing to fight on the ground compared to Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, even old school Jiu-Jitsu. Old school Jiu-Jitsu focused so heavily on the ground because they knew on mats or on the beach, that's where you could spend a lot of the time one-on-one. Again, you don't want to do this against multiple opponents to prove your style. If this was a style that I would explain as anything. It's, as I said earlier, a bravado style. It's a style that allows you to express your ego, because in true one-on-one, manly, unarmed, fair combat, this is probably, even till today, outside of like MMA, one of the best things you can do. Because the reality is, as long as you can get close to someone, which most fights do end up close, you will end up on the ground. If you just practice a little bit of takedowns, tucking your chin, some clean striking for entries only. The big mistake is that a lot of jiu-jitsu guys start trying to become strikers. No, you just want to hit enough that you transition into getting close and taking the guy down. If you just focus on that, it's a great system to be a tough guy. But again, I don't know if that's necessarily all you need for self-defense. For self-defense, you need to be able to knock a guy out extremely fast. You don't need to be able to tie up with them on the ground. You need to be able to control your footwork so that you don't get tied up if there's multiple people. If you are going to get close, the skill I rather have is the one that allows me to smash their head through the concrete with a hard throw, rather than taking them down kind of sloppy, but then being a superhero on the ground. But again, the great irony here is the jiu-jitsu guy will beat the sambo guy in sport. The jiu-jitsu guy will beat the judo guy in sport grappling, so long as the rule set allows them to continue on the ground. And so it's a little caveat. I don't even know how to say that word. Caveat. It's a little trick that jiu-jitsu has that allows it to excel in that environment. Same for old school MMA, where the fight was in a ring that was relatively soft, bouncy, and you could continue the fight on the ground against guys who definitely did not have the kind of experience they needed to deal with that. That's what made it so special. It's a real interesting thing, what jiu-jitsu is. Let's just look. But again, if you gave me a power for the street and you said, hey, you could be medium blue belt level on the ground, but black belt sambo or judo level at throwing, versus being black belt level on the ground, but there is no blue belt in sambo, there's master of sport, but let's just say the equivalent of that for throwing. I would take being an expert at throwing and being mediocre on the ground for street self-defense over the opposite. So I'm tired of, everyone's always like, jiu-jitsu is the best self-defense. It just became so trendy and so popular. What I will also say about modern day jiu-jitsu is that modern day jiu-jitsu is optimized, specialized, and focused on beating other modern day jiu-jitsu players. That is the purpose of modern day jiu-jitsu. It is a sport nowadays, unless you go to some gyms where they really focus on MMA or they focus on self-defense. Overall, a sport. And the great irony is the guys who focus on self-defense will come nowhere close to performing well against the guys who are good at sport jiu-jitsu in sport jiu-jitsu. But when push comes to shove on the street, they might just be better prepared. And I keep seeing these videos of sport jiu-jitsu guys going to self-defense jiu-jitsu schools, Brazilian jiu-jitsu schools that are a little bit more old school, dominating some of their black belts and being like, oh, this school sucks. This school's bullshit. Whatever they say, those people will lose in competition. They will lose in sparring, in just grappling sparring. But very few of those competition jiu-jitsu guys are going, okay, let's turn this into a real scrap and let me see if I win or lose. That might change things. And again, competition schools come with higher rates of injury, come with guys who are taking PEDs, all types of stuff, whereas self-defense schools tend to bring in the person who does not want to do that. They tend to bring in the doctor or older women or whatever, someone who's been attacked. So there's a different clientele coming in. You have a different base clientele because their intentions and their goals are different. People who want to compete are typically young, strong, athletic males, by and large. That's just what it is. That's what I was when I started, and that's what I wanted. And everyone in the gym was like that, to the point where guys were literally getting their neck broken. ACLs getting torn all the time. That's where I tore my ACL back in the day, training hard. But all types of injuries. Let's just look at this last one.
Gracie had no problem closing.
I'm just going to rewind this. I want you to look at some of the fundamentals here of old fighting. It's just interesting to see. I mean, it's just fighting has evolved so tremendously since this time. Just our understanding of what you should and shouldn't do. Look at Royce's stance and look at the other guy's stance. Both of them, crazy. From a fight perspective, self-defense perspective, crazy. from any type of striking background perspective, unless you're Alex Pereira, who apparently can get away with anything, this is not sound structure. First, we'll look at Horian, not Horian, at Hoyler. So hands right by the waist, okay, close together in an awkward position. His base is actually terrible. He's kind of bladed. Most importantly, shoulders down, chin high up in the air, and hopping around. This is almost like old school Taekwondo stance. Even Taekwondo guys back in the 80s held their hands higher than this. And then the Kung Fu guy, come on, what am I going to say? This guy's standing like he's in line to grab a burger, which is why, I mean, maybe he was hoping hands low he could sprawl, but he doesn't know how to sprawl, which, by the way, is the only fundamental first defense to a takedown, to a double leg. If you don't know how to sprawl, if you don't have good hips, you don't have good takedown defense. But there you go. He was hoping to knee him, catch him off guard. Anyway, that's the great shocker for people who haven't experienced jiu-jitsu before, and he's still not sprawling. He's keeping his legs together, which is why his back gets taken and he gets messed up right here. All right, that's straightforward jiu-jitsu, and what will happen time and time again against a guy who doesn't know how to grapple. That's just what it is. Back then it's true, and it's true today. Grappling is an essential skill set for this kind of competition or this kind of fighting. Essential. And again, jiu-jitsu excels at this. And you could see the integration of strikes really changes things. And that's how people used to train. There was a certain degree of toughness that was different. He's getting choked out here. It's done. Yeah, he's finished. He's flattened out, hips low, good fundamentals. This is all you need for fighting. You need clean fundamentals. You know what I mean? You don't need all the fancy stuff that we're seeing today. And it's ironic because I do all the fancy stuff, if I'm being honest with you guys. I enjoy it. And actually, sometimes when I'm doing it, I realize just how counterproductive it is because I'm training such bad habits for self-defense. Inverting, do you know how crazy it is to train inverting all the time, which is probably like one of the most basic things nowadays that people do in jiu-jitsu? It's just a crazy concept on concrete to start inverting against a guy who could just pick you up and slam you on your neck or start punching you in the head. But these are the habits we're drilling into ourselves to beat other people at sport jiu-jitsu. And the leg lock centric approach nowadays, also from a street perspective, is a little bit psychotic. It's why you don't see that many heel hooks in MMA. It's just not what you see people winning with. And again, so the more you're drilling that, the Gordon Ryan approach to fighting, right? He does a ton of heel hooks. It's just become, everyone does heel hooks today. Musamechi, that's just the approach to jiu-jitsu nowadays because it's the easiest submission to pull off, in my opinion. It's one of the easier submissions. And it's one of the more threatening, quick submissions that you have to tap to. Your knee's getting blown out and it happens real fast. And I've always found the reason I like legs early on is because the articulation, the expression of legs is weaker than the expression of hands. You use your hands every day. You're far more understanding of your hands and arms than you are of your legs. Even though you walk with your legs, you don't articulate them the same way. You don't write with them. Think of the fine motor function you do with your hands compared to your legs. So when someone grabs your leg and starts cranking it, your body doesn't react the same way as in hand, where you have such fine motor functions. When an armbar comes, you have sensitivity. You could rotate. You could do things. It's a lot scarier with your knee. Your whole body kind of has to move with your legs to protect it. And knee injuries are just much, much scarier in general. I will say this, and I don't know if it's true, but when I first started learning Sambo, they told me that the reason they attack legs so much was because imagine if you're in war and you could take out a soldier's knee. You could compound fracture his knee really badly. It would take at least one or two other soldiers to help carry him out. So you were essentially taking out 2 to 3 soldiers with one submission. And that was the philosophy back then. Don't know if it's true. But again, just interesting to see how much striking has evolved since then. But I'll say it's evolved. I know a lot of jiu-jitsu guys who that's all they do and they don't know how to strike at all. Although the same for wrestling. Look at Ben Askren. What a disaster that was coming into the UFC. And Jake Paul, fighting Jake Paul. There's a lot of wrestlers, a lot of grapplers who just don't know how to strike. Same thing. Gets taken down again. Outside leg trip. Rolls. And I mean, these strikes on the ground, very hard for them to knock you out. Your leverage is gone. And this is going to be over very quick, just like it was time and time and time again back in the day. A superpower. This is a weird video because I'm both bashing jiu-jitsu and praising jiu-jitsu. And I think that that's just where I ended up with the style. I think that's just kind of, after all the years of doing it, that's just how I feel about it. And if you do jiu-jitsu, I'd love to hear your thoughts, because it's a really interesting thing for me. And I've become far more self-defense oriented, especially as I get older. And I'm like, you know, do I want to almost revamp my training now so that I focus on no-gi, overhooks, controlling, getting back to my feet, almost like an MMA approach to jiu-jitsu, where I'm hyper aware of the punches, controlling posture? Or do I want to keep doing sport jiu-jitsu, where I enjoy it and I invert and I go, you know, crazy moves and I spin around to your back and I'm doing heel hooks? Like, maybe that's not the way to train for self-defense. Realistically not. But again, if your ego comes into play, that's the way to beat other grapplers. And so what you'll do is you'll naturally optimize yourself for where your ego wants you to go, which is to win. Win, win, win. That's what your ego tells you. Your ego is not actually leading you to survive. Your ego is leading you to prove dominance. And that's not what you need for self-defense. So interesting kind of thought there that just hit me. Anyway, this was a long video. I hope it was fun. A lot of ranting. So I apologize for that. This one's a little bit different. But again, dedicated most of my life to this sport. Love it dearly. Got some of my best friends into this, and now they're black belts or brown belts. And so just very cool to see kind of what a wonderful part of my life it's been and how it's changed and evolved, for better or worse. Hey, if you like this video, please comment below, like and subscribe. Let me know your thoughts. This one, I actually would love to hear what people think. Hate it or love it.